All right, hello, honors class. We're going to try this technology thing here for the first time. See if I can give you an online lecture. I hope this works. So just follow along with the screen recording here. Make sure that you take notes. I highly recommend that you take notes with your Cornell Notes system, and make sure at the end you summarize what it is that we've gone over. Also, if you have any questions about the material covered in this lecture, make sure you talk to your classmates first, see if they know. Also, you can look at the book, the textbook. You should have a copy of the chapter that pertains to this. Finally, if you have any final questions, you can email me, of course. All right, let's begin. The Bill of Rights, an introduction. I had a professor put it this way. Say you take a piece of fruit, like an apple, and you're trying to describe it to somebody who's never seen an apple before. What would you say about it? Well, it's red, it's kind of roundish. If you cut it open, it's white and it can be kind of juicy. The thing is, as you go describing it, you're also describing things that it's not. And my professor's point was just by defining and describing something, you're limiting it down to what it can be. By giving it its descriptions, you're also detailing what it's not. This is the problem of definitions, and a lot of what James Madison and the Federalists were afraid of when it came to a Bill of Rights. Again, if we try to legally define our rights, what happens if we miss something? What happens if we actually, by writing something down, we're actually limiting something that should not be limited, something that is really, really important to us? Along with that, we have some questions that we should go over and that I want you to think about through this lecture. One is, what were the different options for a Bill of Rights? We tend to see the Bill of Rights today, it's the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, and we tend to think, well, yeah, it's always been like that, but there were actually a lot of different ways it could have been done. The second question pertains to that. What is the difference between amendments and a Bill of Rights? We say the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments, but there's 17 other amendments that are not part of the Bill of Rights. So what's the difference? Third, why did James Madison change from an opponent to becoming the father of the Bill of Rights? And then last, how would the Bill of Rights be made? All right, let's jump in. So, problems with proposing a Bill of Rights. Three problems that we're going to go over. Well, two problems and then the examples. One, A is the procedural problem. B, problems with the proposals themselves. And then I'll give you some examples of those proposals. The first was the procedural problem, in that how would the Bill of Rights or how would amendments be made? Well, part of that, one way to do it was by the amendment process that is laid out in the Constitution itself, which is very incredibly difficult to do because it takes a supermajority just to propose an amendment and 3/4 of the state conventions or the people themselves to ratify the amendments. That's why only 27 have been made. Going through that process can be incredibly difficult. The second option was to have a second constitutional convention, which several anti-federalists were proposing. And James Madison and the Federalists, most of the guys who were there at the Constitutional Convention were like, we don't want to go through that again. We would just open up a can of worms, and we would always be going through this cycle of, well, just instability, because no one knows what's going on. Do we have a constitution? Do we not? We're always in a state of having a convention, and that just wouldn't work. So that's the procedural problem. Another problem is just the problems of the proposals themselves. Some, James Madison thought, were just dangerous. Some were structural changes that would fundamentally alter the government as we know it. For instance, the proposal of going from a one-person executive branch to a council of three. Some would lead to a weaker central government. Again, this is kind of what the anti-federalists want. The Federalists saw that as going back to the Articles of Confederation, which, of course, we didn't want. And some proposals were somewhat problematic, like the proposal to include having the right of revolution, keeping that language from the Declaration. But is that an appropriate thing to put into the founding document of the government itself? Is that appropriate to have something in there about the people have the right to revolt? It's kind of a problem. And then finally, some examples to kind of help you out, explain, or just to show you guys what the problems were. Virginia proposed 20 amendments, to the Constitution and 20 bills of rights. New York proposed provisional ratification, meaning that, yeah, we would ratify if, and that big if was as long as New York would be allowed to secede when it wanted to. Again, kind of a problem. There is the Massachusetts Compromise. This is the last example here. The Massachusetts Compromise, which you all know, was ratify the Constitution now and amend later. But they also included amendments. They also included proposed amendments. They said, yeah, we'll ratify the Constitution now, as long as we can ratify. We can add some bills of rights later. And here they are. Here's our proposals. Again, problems. Next slide. Enter James Madison. So remember, Madison at first was an opponent of having a Bill of Rights when he wrote the Federalist Papers because, again, the problem of definitions. Also the problem of all these proposals. Which ones should we have? Eventually, because of the Massachusetts Compromise, Madison began to see the light and said, look, if it's got to be done, and people in good faith ratified the Constitution expecting us to include a Bill of Rights later, we should go ahead and do it. And if it's going to be done well, I might as well go ahead and do it. So he's sitting in the House of Representatives on June 8th, 1789, and he proposes his Bill of Rights. And he wanted a Bill of Rights, not amendments. What does that mean? Well, first, that means he wanted it included in the Constitution itself, in the document, within Article 1, because as we're going to see, the Bill of Rights specifically state it's Congress that cannot touch these specific things. It's Congress that cannot take away your freedom of speech. Congress cannot take away your freedom of religion. Therefore, the Bill of Rights should be placed in the article that is all about Congress. Let's backtrack a little bit. When Madison proposed his amendments, there was some resistance in the House of Representatives. Some representatives were like, look, we got too many other problems going on in the country to really deal with the Bill of Rights because that's just going to be a mess. We need to organize the government first. We need to see if the Constitution works even before amending it. But Madison had a good argument. And his argument is, look, there are reasons for postponing this issue, but the will of the people demand it and expect it, and there's other reasons why we should do it. The first reason why we need to go ahead and tackle a Bill of Rights is there's a threat of a second constitutional convention, which would just open a huge can of worms. If they didn't do the Bill of Rights, the Anti-Federalists would gang up and get the second constitutional convention going, and then that would just lead to more instability, much more of a mess. Again, the main objection the Anti-Federalists had to the Constitution was lack of Bill of Rights, and that's easily fixable. We could do it now. Third, if he's in control, he can get rid of all those proposed structural changes to the Constitution. There's also, again, what we mentioned before, having that spirit of amity, spirit of accommodation. Yes, our enemies, they fought against us in the ratification debate, and they lost. But we should go ahead and help them out because they are still Americans. They wanted a Bill of Rights. We should do that. There's also a normative argument. The argument that the people need a reminder of their rights from time to time, and that the Bill of Rights acts not just as a something that stops the government, but also teaches us. It teaches us that it's a reminder to us to not give in to tyranny. So now let's get to Madison's proposals. Again, Madison wanted these scattered throughout the Constitution, especially in Article 1, and not just tacked at the end. But others disagreed, and they won out. The Constitution should be left alone, they argued. And just add a Bill of Rights to the end of it. It's like, let's not crack it open. And in this case, I think Madison was wrong. If we crack open the Constitution and we just start adding stuff throughout it, it's kind of like cracking open an egg. It's going to be hard to uncrack it. So in a sense, just tacking it in at the end was probably the best way to go. So let's look at Madison's proposals. And there's 7 points under this, under point D. So number 1, add a Bill of Rights as a preface to the Constitution before the preamble. He wanted to connect the Declaration to the Constitution. His second proposal was amend representation in the House, allow for adding more representatives. 3, He wanted an amendment stopping congressional pay. He didn't want Congress to be able to vote themselves effectively a pay raise, that any raise in salary for representatives would only go into effect after the next congressional session. That way, the people that actually made the raise wouldn't necessarily benefit unless they got reelected. Oddly enough, this is what became the 27th Amendment, which didn't get passed until 1993. Fourth, he wanted to add a list of rights to Article 1, Section 9, 17 items because they're the ones that restrain Congress. 5, he wanted limits on state governments. Again, he wanted that in Article 1, but in Section 10. 6, he wanted a limit on frivolous lawsuits. So this proposed amendment was you can't sue somebody for an amount under $20. And that's actually what made it into the Constitution. It's in Article, or in Amendment number 7. Excuse me. And then lastly, he wanted to add reserved powers. Something in there that says, look, if the Constitution does not give specific powers to the government, to Congress, or the executive branch, it is reserved for the people or for the states. So let's see what happened to Madison's proposals. It was sent to a committee in the House, which passed, out of 39 proposals, passed 38. The House itself passed 35. The Senate whittled that down to 28, and eventually only 10 were ratified. So again, it's interesting to remember a couple of things about this. That what is the First Amendment that we think is so darn important was actually not the First Amendment. It was actually his fourth proposal. Second, Madison lost the argument of putting the amendments through, or the changes to the Bill of Rights throughout the Constitution. Instead, they were just tacked on to the end. Lastly, out of all of that, only 10 were ratified, and those first 10 changes, those first 10 amendments, are what we now know as the Bill of Rights. So in closing, one thing to note, and I find this rather fascinating, is that the Bill of Rights in the old world sense, like in England, they had a Bill of Rights passed in 1688. The whole point of the Bill of Rights was to protect the many against the few or the one, to protect the people against the tyranny of a king. In the Bill of Rights in our version, it's a little different, actually. It protects the one and the few, the minority, against the many. Because if the many are represented in Congress, and Congress is the one who wields power, if the government is indeed made up by we the people, we need a Bill of Rights to protect us as individuals against the many.